Assalamu alaikum students, welcome back to class. Let's quickly go over what we have done so far and then we'll go on to the topic for today. If you remember from all the lectures that I've been delivering so far, we have concentrated on the writings of one essayist, that is Francis Bacon. Bacon lived during the Renaissance, and as such he was an embodiment of all that was essentially Renaissance man, in the sense that he delved in different aspects of knowledge, and his essays were actually the essence of his experience in so many different branches of life, and this was combined with his knowledge, with his reading, to give you Bacon's insight into the different aspects of life. The kind of essay writing that we're going to be doing now is slightly different. I'm sure most of you have heard of the name of The Spectator, and the two people who contributed to this paper, and that is Joseph Addison and Richard Steele. Now, when we talk about The Spectator, we're talking about a whole new age. From the Renaissance age, we are taking a big jump and coming on to the Restoration age. Now, when we talk about the Restoration age, what we're basically talking about is the restoration of the monarchy in England. So whenever anybody throws out this phrase at you and says what is meant by the Restoration age, you, because you have your background of the history of English literature also, you can quickly give examples of what the Restoration age stood for, and as far as literature is concerned, what are the salient features of the Restoration age. And one of the salient features of the Restoration age is the essay writing of Addison and Steele in The Spectator. But before we go on to that, let me give you just a brief overview of the Restoration age. This was actually the bringing back to power of the rightful heir to the throne, and that was King Charles II. We did Bacon, and when we were doing Bacon, we talked about Queen Elizabeth I, King James I. King James I was followed by his son, King Charles I, but it was during the reign of King Charles I that Parliament became very strong, and because they were tired of the extravagant tastes of King Charles I and the fact that Charles I was basically a weak king. So it ended with Charles I being executed and Parliament declaring England and Scotland to be the Commonwealth. And when this Commonwealth was declared, Parliament and Oliver Cromwell took over basically the ruling of England. And during this time, various attempts were made to dethrone Parliament or to take power away from Parliament, but they were unsuccessful until the time of King Charles II. So with the arrival of King Charles II on the scene of England, there was joy and celebration throughout England. And this joy and celebration went to such extremes that people and the Parliament grew tired of the excesses to which King Charles II and his court went. So basically the Restoration age talks not only about the time that actually was the time of restoration of monarchy, but it talks of the time following that also. So what I'm trying to tell you is that the Restoration Age was characterized by an outburst of creativity, which again, because the monarchy had newly been restored, whatever was being created was rather superficial. A lot of literature was created, but a lot of the literature that was created was not really what you would call standard literature. In the sense that, for example, in the field of literature, you had a lot of dramas being written, and they are characterized under the heading of restoration comedy. Because everyone was so happy at the monarchy being restored, there was no focus on the dark side of life. It was all joy and celebration. So a lot of comedies were being written, and some of these comedies were not really standard comedies. Now, when you talk about standard and non-standard or substandard comedies, what you're talking about basically is that some of the dramas that were written were really good quality dramas. For example, Dryden was writing drama, but a lot of these were no less than a farce, and a lot of license was taken to the extent that ultimately the theaters had to be closed down. This was how far restoration comedy had gone. But that was not the only genre in which creativity was going on. One of the fields in which a lot was created was in the field of essay writing. And Joseph Addison and Richard Steele, they started writing in the newspaper that was known as The Spectator. A strange name for a newspaper, but this newspaper embodied what was essentially the Restoration. And when we go through some of the essays that were presented in The Spectator, you will realize how different the writing is from that of the essays who preceded, and how different the theme, content, and style is from the writing that had been done up to that point. All right? So let's have a couple of slides that show us what The Spectator was basically about, and then we'll go on to the essay proper. Now you'll notice that there is no name to the essay given. Yes, you do see the title of The Spectator, but what you see under that is number 1, Thursday, March 1st, 1711. So this March 1st, 1711 is the date on which the first essay was written by Joseph Addison, and it was published. So we'll come to the essay in a bit, but first something about The Spectator. And of course, the writers, Addison and Steele. Now the first essay that we'll be dealing with is written by Joseph Addison. So I'm going to give you a bit about the life and works of Joseph Addison. And when we're doing the second essay, which is written by Richard Steele, I'm going to tell you a little about Richard Steele. So first, Joseph Addison. All right? Now, Joseph Addison was born in Wiltshire, and at 14 years of age, he began attending the Charterhouse School, whose alumni included various people who were rather well known. And it was at this school that Addison first made the acquaintance of Richard Steele, and this acquaintance later on went on to form a team which would write in The Spectator. So he completed his master's in 1693 from Oxford. In 1695, Addison wrote a poem to His Majesty William III. And you know that King William III was married to Queen Mary II. Now this Queen Mary II inherited the throne, but because William, her husband, was also related to her, and therefore William III could claim the throne in his own right. So you had Mary II and William III ruling at the time that Addison wrote this first poem. This brought him to the attention of influential politicians who saw much potential in the young scholar. So this poem that he dedicated to his king brought him fame and the attention of those who mattered. So he was granted, as it was the rule in those days, he was granted a pension of £300, and this enabled him to travel on the continent. And you know, the continent in those days, as now, stood for Europe. So now what you consider to be Europe was referred to as the continent. And this pension, and £300 pension, in those days was a very big sum. Even now, when you convert it into rupees, it's going to come into a few thousand. But at that time, having a pension of £300 was a big deal. So on his return, Addison fell in with this club, which is an association of political and literary figures, and he associated with people who were writing, and this gradually brought him to the point where he was dabbling in many different genres of literature. Now, Addison was a man of some importance. He wasn't just an essayist. He was elected to the Parliament in 1708. He went on to become the Secretary of State for Irish Affairs, and from there he came to the point where they launched The Spectator, in which Addison was writing essays, and they sort of alternated almost. If Addison wrote an essay one day, Steele would write another, but they came to be associated with each other to such an extent that they were known as Addison and Steele, and The Spectator was known because of Addison and Steele. So from a team, it just became sort of one phrase that was used to refer to The Spectator. So this was a daily publication, and it started in 1711. If you remember, the first slide said March 1st, 1711, and went on to 1712. Each paper or number had a definite length, and it says here that it had to be 2,500 words long. So those of you who have to do writing where the number of words is specified, this will be a very good example of how you can fit all your ideas into the required number of words. You could not go beyond 2,500 words. And it says that there was a total of 555 numbers or papers that were published. And March 1st, 1711 was the first issue. The goal of The Spectator was to enliven morality with wit and to temper wit with morality. Now, this is something that you need to think about. Go back to my earlier statement where I said that the period that is being talked about is Restoration, and the restoration of monarchy, a time of joy and celebration, not a time when a lot of things are happening outside the country or where there is fear within the country. So stability, economic, financial, political. Political stability because the succession was secure. Political instability in monarchies always happens when there is some fear in succession. With Queen Elizabeth I, even this was taken care of because prior to the Tudors, it had to have been a male heir, and only a male heir could succeed. And if the king did not have a male heir, succession was always rather dicey. So Lady Jane Grey, being the first Queen of England, Queen Elizabeth I was also crowned Queen, and thereafter the English people or the English Parliament did not really have to wonder what would happen if there was no son for the king. So with succession being assured, there were no fears of anyone from outside attacking or any other force trying to take possession of the throne by force. So succession assured, there was political stability. Economic stability followed the defeat of the Spanish Armada and bringing all that wealth into the country, the establishment of colonies, and the money and the wealth that could be brought in from other parts of the world to England. So coming back to the goal of the Spectator, it was to enliven morality with wit. So morality is there, the instruction part is there, the lessons are there, but they have to be expressed in a light manner. No heavy instruction, no moralization where you start thinking, oh, I've had enough of lessons for today, let me not hear any more of do this and don't do that, and if you do this, you will go to hell, and if you don't do that, you will go to hell. So less of morality, and what morality was there, it was treated in such a way that it didn't really rankle with a person. Morality rankles when it becomes very heavy. So, and to temper wit with morality. So, controlling wit or humor or comedy by using instructions in the essay writing. So, a twofold purpose: to enliven morality with wit and to temper wit with morality. That's one half. The other goal was to bring philosophy out of the closets and libraries. To go back to Bacon, Bacon was a very learned man, and so he quoted a lot from Latin because he was fluent in the language. Fast forward to Addison and Steele, and you have less of Latin. The impression is there in the sense that the essays start with a Latin quote, but then the text is in English, and you will see that the language also develops with the passage of time and with the increased use of the language. So to bring philosophy out of the closets and libraries, schools and colleges. So philosophy is being moved from schools and colleges, from places of learning, closets and libraries. No more is it just something that is being written about. It was actually being practiced. So bringing it into clubs and assemblies, tea tables and coffee houses. So bringing philosophy out of the libraries, out of those huge thick volumes, those tomes in which philosophy had been hidden, and bringing it out into the tea house, the club and the assembly, where it was used by the educated people. Now the differentiation still is that these are the learned people. It's still not ordinary people who have access to learning. This is still the educated class, still what is known as the aristocracy, that's using the learning that has so far been hidden in the books and the library. So still the educated, and education still confined to a great extent to the aristocracy. The public still does not have access to learning, to scholarship, to education. One of the principal conceits of The Spectator is its fictional narrator, Mr. Spectator. So, as the name denotes, he is a spectator. He's not a participant. He's not obviously there. He's there on the outside as an observer, as a neutral observer who is giving his comments on whatever he sees, whatever happens, whatever takes place. The first number of this is dedicated to his life story. So when we go on to number 1, you'll see that Mr. Spectator introduces himself, gives you his story. He speaks very little, communicating mainly through facial gestures. His unassuming profile enables him to circulate widely throughout society and fulfill his position as spectator. Now, the difference between spectator or observer and participant is that the first just observes. He's an outsider, neutral. The participant, because he takes part in everything, has a bias. The spectator does not have a bias, is not prejudiced. Whatever he sees, whatever he hears, whatever he observes, he puts it down on paper without obviously moralizing. But since critics have said that morality is tempered with wit, you'll see that there are places where Addison and Steele tell you what's right and what's wrong, but it's very subtle. It's hidden. It's not do this and don't do that. You can't do this, but you can do this. It's not that at all. It's very, very subtle. You have to read between the lines to get at the moral, the lesson, the instruction. So he comments on habits, foibles, social faux pas of his fellow citizens. He is making a commentary. He's a spectator, remember. And as a spectator, he does not offer his own viewpoint obviously. He does it in a hidden manner, in a very subtle manner. So, despite a modest daily circulation of about 3,000 copies, The Spectator was widely read, and the reason is that it was easily accessible. It was accessible through the tea houses, through the clubs, so that people who went there could read them, because those comments were being made about them. And who amongst us is not reading or is not interested in reading about himself or herself? All of us are. So when these papers were published, a lot of people read them not by subscribing to The Spectator, but by going to places where it was subscribed. So if you had 2 or 3 copies in a tea house or in a club, you'd have, let's say, 15 to 20 people reading it, maybe more, maybe less than that in a day, depending on what was being written and who was being written about. Okay? All right, so we come on to the first issue, and this one, remember, has been written by Joseph Addison. And what you'll see is that it starts off with a quotation by Horace, and translated it means, not the smoke from the flame, but imagine out of the smoke to produce light, and then brought forth a beautiful wonder. Now don't look at the grammar, because this is a literal translation. So out of the smoke to bring forth a light, an idea. And you know, knowledge has always been synonymous with light, where ignorance is synonymous with darkness. So where knowledge is the day, is the sun rising, ignorance is darkness descending, nightfall. All right? So let's see what Mr. Addison has for us today. Remember, this is the first issue of The Spectator, and in this, Mr. Spectator, the fictional construct, is going to tell us his life story. How he describes himself, we'll see in a bit. So this is the first issue, published on March 1st, 1711. I have observed that a reader seldom peruses a book with pleasure till he knows whether the writer of it be black or a fair, man of a mild or choleric disposition, married or a bachelor, with other particulars of like nature that conduce very much to the right understanding of an author. So right off, he says that I need to identify myself, and what he's actually doing is, this preamble is a justification for his description of himself. So this first essay is like the essay that sometimes you may have had to write about myself. You know, the essay is titled Myself, and you are told to write something about your life, your habits, your nature and temperament, your educational background, etc., etc. So Mr. Spectator starts off and he says that readers do not read books until they know something about the author. Now I know there may be some of you sitting out there who will say, well, I go by other things. I go and see what the title page is like. I go and see what the title itself is like. But then we are talking about different readers. Mr. Addison's idea of a reader is one who wants to know who the author is, what he is like, what his likes and dislikes are, what is his status in society, as he says, whether he is married or a bachelor, because all these things color your opinions. All these things will ensure that your writing has a specific bias. All right, so after this preamble, he starts off with his description. All right, so we come on to the first issue, and this one, remember, has been written by Joseph Addison. And what you'll see is that it starts off with a quotation by Horace, and translated it means, not the smoke from the flame, but imagine out of the smoke to produce light, and then brought forth a beautiful wonder. Now don't look at the grammar, because this is a literal translation. So out of the smoke to bring forth a light, an idea. And you know, knowledge has always been synonymous with light, where ignorance is synonymous with darkness. So where knowledge is the day, is the sun rising, ignorance is darkness descending, nightfall. All right? So let's see what Mr. Addison has for us today. Remember, this is the first issue of The Spectator, and in this, Mr. Spectator, the fictional construct, is going to tell us his life story. How he describes himself, we'll see in a bit. So, this is the first issue, published on March 1st, 1711. I have observed that a reader seldom peruses a book with pleasure till he knows whether the writer of it be black or a fair, man of a mild or choleric disposition, married or a bachelor, with other particulars of like nature that conduce very much to the right understanding of an author. So right off, he says that I need to identify myself, and what he's actually doing is, this preamble is a justification for his description of himself. So this first essay is like the essay that sometimes you may have had to write about myself. You know, the essay is titled Myself, and you are told to write something about your life, your habits, your nature and temperament, your educational background, etc., etc. So Mr. Spectator starts off and he says that readers do not read books until they know something about the author. Now, I know there may be some of you sitting out there who will say, well, I go by other things. I go and see what the title page is like. I go and see what the title itself is like. But then we are talking about different readers. Mr. Addison's idea of a reader is one who wants to know who the author is, what he is like, what his likes and dislikes are, what is his status in society, as he says, whether he is married or a bachelor, because all these things color your opinions. All these things will ensure that your writing has a specific bias. All right, so after this preamble, he starts off with his description. And yet, this estate, a small hereditary estate which had been in his family, stayed the same. No increase, no decrease. So, as he says, has been delivered whole from father to son, same size. The estate was not increased and neither was it decreased. There runs a story in the family that when my mother was gone with child of me about 3 months, she dreamt that she was brought to bed of a judge. Whether this might proceed from a lawsuit which was then depending in the family on my father's being a justice of the peace, I cannot determine. So he's telling you about the time that he spent in his mother's womb, and he also tells us that his father was a justice of the peace. And you know, this this honorary position of justice of the peace was given to the most famous or the most well thought of noblemen in that community. So every community had a justice of the peace, and in the majority of cases this was a nobleman. You had to have a title in order to qualify for justice of the peace. It wasn't something for which you had to sit for an exam. It wasn't something that you had to come up to the merit for, or you could also say that the only merit was that you had to have a title. So Mr. Spectator's father was a justice of the peace. Now what he's trying to tell you here is that he came from a noble family. He was not a commoner, you know, not a person who was without any property. And in England, in those ages, you were nobody unless you had property, unless you had land. A little like what we have here with the feudal setup. If you go to the countryside, you have to possess land. If you don't possess land, you are a nobody. You're no one. Even if it's a little bit of land, you must have that, because that gives you your identity. So we are now where the Englishmen were in the 18th century. So back to the 18th century, 1711, and Mr. Spectator describing himself and his family. The gravity of my behavior at my very first appearance in the world, and all the time that I sucked, seemed to favor my mother's dream. Now, one thing you'll notice here is that Addison, and later on Steele also, uses words that start with capital letters. You have appearance, you have gravity, behavior, time. Why do you think that is so? It's because he wants to lend emphasis to a word. Just as now you have bold and you have underlining and you have italics and you have those fancy fonts, none of this was available in the time of Addison and Steele. So every now and then you have a letter starting with a capital letter, and you know that that is a key word. That's a very important word, and one that you need to focus on. So he says that I was very serious as an infant. Not the kind of infant who is, always chuckling and always smiling, but a very serious infant, even when he was a baby. So, and this is characterized by the examples that he gives. He says, I threw away my rattle before I was 2 months old. So a baby having the grip and being able to throw things is strange indeed. But that is Mr. Spectator for you. So he threw away his rattle before he was 2 months old, and he wouldn't make use of his coral till they had taken away the bells from it. So he didn't want to wear any jewelry at all that had bells, because bells made that tinkling sound, and he didn't like it. He was very, very serious. So the gravity of his behavior as a baby is worth noting. For the rest of my infancy, and he skips over it, says, there being nothing remarkable, I shall pass it over in silence. So fast forward from infancy. And then he comes on to his adolescence. Adolescence is a very tricky period, more so for young boys perhaps than for young girls, in the sense that they don't know what to do. They have a lot of energy, but they do not know how to channelize it. There are a lot of what doctors today refer to as hormonal changes taking place in puberty, and young boys do not know what to do, how to express their feelings and emotions at that time. So he says that during my nonage, I had the reputation of a very sullen youth. So he wasn't a very happy-go-lucky boy, very serious, sober, almost bad-tempered. And the only person who appreciated this was Mr. Spectator's schoolmaster. Now you need to keep in mind the fact that all this is fictitious. Mr. Spectator was not a human being, in the sense that this is Addison and Steele writing, but because they have to write from the point of view of one individual, so they are creating this persona of Mr. Spectator. So Mr. Spectator was very serious in school, and the schoolmaster liked him because he said that my parts were solid and would wear well. And he used to say, this is a very solid young man, and he's going to do good. But he was the only person who thought that something good could be done. And then of course he graduates and goes on to university, where the most distinguishing characteristic, the most important feature of his nature was a profound silence. Yes, that is what characterized Mr. Spectator. A most profound silence, no speech whatsoever. During the space of 8 years, now 8 years he spent at the university, and according to him, he did not utter more than 2 lines at the same time. Let's see how Addison expresses it. He says, I scarce uttered the quantity of 100 words. 100 words in 8 years? What is he talking about? But then he's talking about Mr. Spectator, not a real young man, not a young man of today who during his university days is full of enthusiasm, has opinions on everything, and wants to ensure that those opinions, experiences, and knowledge is expressed. So, a rather reticent young man, 8 years in the university, and he says that I did not speak above 100 words. Hard to believe, yes, but then Mr. Spectator is not a real human being. He's a fictional construct. So, there you have Mr. Spectator. Whilst I was in this learned body, I applied myself with so much diligence to my studies that there are very few celebrated books, either in the learned or modern languages, which I am not acquainted with. A person who's not speaking has to be doing something. So what was Mr. Spectator doing? He was reading, he was reading, he was reading. So, reading, reading, reading. And reading everything that he could lay his hands on in the library. Reading books in what he calls the learned languages, and that is Latin and Greek, and the modern languages, which would be French, Italian, German, whatever, Spanish. All these languages, Mr. Spectator knew, and not only did he know, but he could read in these languages. So, all the time that he was silent, he wasn't doing nothing. He was definitely reading. And here he's telling you one aspect of his personality, and that is that of a silent person. The reason for his silence is he's not a speaker. He's not a participant, remember. He's a spectator. He's an observer. And an observer has to be a reader. So Mr. Spectator is a reader. And he reads everything. 8 years he spent in the university. And in those 8 years, he says, I read practically everything that was readable. Upon the death of my father, I was resolved to travel into foreign countries, and therefore left the university with the character of an odd, unaccountable fellow that had a great deal of learning if I would but show it. So how did people know him in the university? They knew him as an odd, unaccountable fellow. They didn't know what to make of him. It's easy to understand a person who speaks, because your speech, like your face, reveals your character, temperament, your nature. But if you are not speaking, how are people to know what your nature is like? So he was dubbed an odd, unaccountable fellow, and he left the university as he had entered, silently. There was no big fanfare when he left, because he was by nature a very quiet person. So 8 years he spends in university, and when his father dies, he wants to travel, he wants to see the world. He doesn't want to say what he has seen in the world, but he just wants to see the world. He wants to be an observer, a spectator. So he goes out into the world to see what the world holds for him. And what the world holds for him is something that he has learned. But the opinion of his friends was, or those who were around him, thought that he was a very learned person, but not the kind of learned person who could show his learning. You show your learning through your speech, through your writing. So while he is in college, he doesn't write, he doesn't speak. People know that he's a learned man because he's reading all the time. He's observing, but he's observing and reading silently. All right? So an insatiable thirst after knowledge carried me into all the countries of Europe. So once his father was dead and he could afford to travel, he went to what was known as the continent, what is now known as Europe, and he visited all the different countries. The reason being his insatiable thirst for knowledge. Just because he's not speaking does not mean he doesn't want to know. There is an overpowering thirst for knowledge. He wants to know everything. So now that he has read all the books that were available to him, he wants to go out and experience for himself what the real world holds. So, to the degree that he had read everything that there was to read, he read the ancients, he read the moderns. He did not pass by anyone of any importance. So, and he was one of those very few people who at that time even went to Egypt, what he calls the Grand Cairo. You had very, very few Europeans wanting to go to Africa, wanting to see what the rest of the world was like. Travels of people in England were restricted to within the country and at the most the continent. The maximum that they would do was they would go and visit the European countries, and that was mainly Italy, France, perhaps Spain, but not very keen to venture outside Europe. So Addison, or the Spectator to be more specific, is one of those who even goes to Egypt because he wants to measure the pyramid himself. Have you ever seen the pyramid? Do you have any idea how huge the pyramids are? And here is Mr. Spectator saying that he visited Egypt because he wanted to measure the pyramid himself. Yes, I thought it a strange idea also when I first read it. But such is his thirst for knowledge. He reads that these are the dimensions of the pyramid, but he wants to see this for himself. The world considers the pyramids one of the great wonders, and yet here is this person who is not satisfied with the written word and wants to confirm for himself whether the pyramids are actually the size that they are described as. I don't want to go and see the pyramids just to measure them. I want to go to see the pyramids because they're so wonderful, because I wonder how people without any machinery, through sheer human labor, could actually build the pyramids. That is why I want to visit the pyramids. And of course, they say that they are really impressive. It's one of the 7 wonders of the world. But here is a person who wants to see the pyramids just because he wants to measure them. He wants to see whether the length, the width matches what has been written. It may be that he will get different measurements. And what does he do when he actually gets there? He takes the measurement and then he comes back. He doesn't say, I want to see the rest of Egypt also. He's gone there for a purpose. The purpose is to measure the pyramids for himself. He does that and he comes back. A strange person indeed. Yes, that is our Mr. Spectator. And then when he comes back, Mr. Spectator says, I have spent my life in this city and I'm seen in most of the public places, though there are not above half a dozen of my select friends that know me. What does that mean? He spent his life in a city and he doesn't have more than 6 friends? How is that possible? If you're in a city and he says, I go to all the public places, then you are seen by people, then people know you. You go to all the functions and people know who you are. For example, if I talk about myself, I'm Shahina Ayub Bhatti. I am a teacher. Although I'm teaching at Namal, I go to all the different universities, wherever they have English departments, wherever there are gatherings of people from the academia. And so I am known. I have spent my life in Islamabad. I know that people know me, but I won't say that only 6 people know me. If I have spent my life here, there will be at least 100 people who know me in this city. But I am not Mr. Spectator. Mr. Spectator is silent. I communicate. I express my ideas, my thoughts, my feelings. And so I am known. But an individual who only sees, hears, observes, and does not give expression to his ideas or thoughts will not be noticed. And that is the beauty of Mr. Spectator. He's there as an observer. He's there and yet not there. So he says, there's no place of general resort where I have not gone. Sometimes I'm seen thrusting my head into a round of politicians at Wills and listening with great attention to the narratives that are made in those little circular audiences. He goes everywhere. He knows everyone. He can identify different people. He knows their life history. And yet, people don't know him. He's not seen. And the reason is, he's silent. He is a spectator. He lives up to his name, and that is Mr. Spectator. So, a very strange character indeed. He says, I go to where politicians gather, I go to the clubhouses, I go to the tea houses, I go everywhere. And yet, people do not know me. I know them. They do not know me. Because you only see people who make their presence felt. That's it for now. Let's quickly recap and go back on what we have done so far. And the rest of this essay we'll leave for the next lecture because it's a longish essay. Remember, 2,500 words is the limit for essays published in The Spectator. So when we recap, we go back to this jump that we have taken from the 17th century to the 18th century, almost 100 years, and during that time you see that a lot has taken place in England. King Charles I succeeded James I, was accused of treason, executed, Parliament took over, Oliver Cromwell ruled England, and then you had the Restoration, you had Charles II coming in and monarchy being restored, joy and celebration throughout England, and a lot of license being given to writers, to artists, to the extent that the Restoration period is known in the history of England as a period of excesses. Everything was done in excess because people had not had a monarch, a king, for a long time. They were so happy at Charles II coming back to England and assuming his duties that they went rather overboard with all this celebration. And the time that The Spectator starts, that is March the 1st, 1711, you are in the reign of Queen Mary II and King William III. Now they were husband and wife, both having equal claim to the throne, and therefore both were monarchs. And that's about the only time that England had had monarchy, and yet the king and queen had succeeded in their own right, were actually crowned king and not crowned as consort, not crowned as the spouse of the monarch, but as king and queen in their own right. So 1711 is the time when Addison and Steele get together and they start publishing The Spectator, which comprises of essays that are written on different themes. They're written about different people that are being met. And the most important thing that you need to know about The Spectator is that it's an unbiased approach. It's morality tempered with wit, not really going overboard with the morality, and not making humor such an important part of the writing that you start ridiculing or making fun of people. So morality tempered with wit, and wit kept in control by morality. So what you find here is a little bit of instruction, what you would call tongue-in-cheek kind of humor, because Mr. Spectator describes himself as an observer, as a person who is looking out at the world around him, but not really participating. He is there as an observer, but an observer who is what you'd call unbiased, impartial. So whatever you see of Mr. Spectator, in this first essay, Addison sets out to describe himself, because as he says, people, when they start to read something, they want to know who the writer is. They want to know whether he's single or married, whether he's black or white, whether he has a position in society or not. So he sets out to describe himself, to give his own life history. And when he describes his history, he describes himself as a nobleman, as one of the aristocracy. The reason is, he's not writing for the common people. He's still writing for the educated class, and the educated class, even in the 18th century, happens to be, in the main, the aristocratic class, the noble class. So he's not one of those big lords who own a lot of property, but he is still of noble descent. And the example that he gives for that is, he says that I was born in a house on, as he says, an estate which had been in the family for more than 600 years. So 600 years is a long time, and the English nobility, because it set a lot of store by land, therefore anyone who owned land was important, and anyone who did not own land was not important at all, and therefore not worth noticing, not worth paying any attention to. So when Mr. Spectator sets out to describe himself, he describes himself as a nobleman who belongs to a family that is old, is not an upstart. It's not that yesterday he got the money, today he got the education, and now he's going to start writing. He's not that kind of a person. He's been everywhere. He got a university education. But the one thing that characterizes him and that differentiates him from other people is the fact that he is silent. He's not dumb. He's intelligent. He can speak. But he chooses not to. He's a spectator, and as a spectator, he chooses to observe, to note down, and not to speak. All right? So this gives him a definite edge over other people. He says, people don't know me, but I know everyone, because I go everywhere. I go to where the politicians gather. I go to the clubhouses, the tea houses. I go to the assemblies. I go to the drama theatre. So he goes everywhere, and yet, because he's silent and he doesn't give expression to his thoughts and ideas through speech, therefore people do not even notice him. But that's not to say that he does not notice anything. But what he notices, we will discuss in the coming lectures, in the succeeding lectures. I think that is enough for today, and we'll meet again in the next lecture, where we're going to discuss what it is that Mr. Spectator has observed about people who surround him. Thank you all very much. Allah Hafiz.